Good morning. My name is Suzanne Kelly. I'm a member of the Westminster Social Justice Team. The Social Justice Forums are built around a common theme. This program year, the theme is Building Solidarity Together, walking alongside all of God's people, striving for a more just world, and acting courageously to transform social systems and relationships. This morning's forum begins a series on current immigration concerns. We are pleased to welcome back to Westminster Julia Decker, Policy Director at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, a nonpartisan immigration legal service provider based in St. Paul. Julia has worked on cases at all levels of the immigration system, up to and including the United States Supreme Court. She previously served as policy director for the Minnesota affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. Her topic today is, the eye of the storm, immigration law and policy in 2025. She will address major trends and updates in immigration law and policy since the Trump administration took office in January of 2025. She will explain those trends, how they look on the ground, including in Minnesota, and how we can stay informed and get involved. So, first, a few items. We ask that you hold your questions and comments until after her presentation. For those attending in person here in the Meisel room, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you so that everyone will be included here in this room and on the live stream. And please hold the microphone directly so we're sure that we pick up your voice. For those attending on the live stream, please submit your comment or questions to the live stream chat and we will monitor that and raise your questions and comments. As part of our ongoing effort to promote respectful conversations around concerns in our community, the Social Justice Team has established guidelines for the social justice forums that you now see on the screen. This morning, I would like to highlight our third point. So if you could look at that, please. Where are we, Jonathan? Concise questions. Because the time is limited, we ask that you go directly to the question without a preamble. Okay, where are we? Oh, let's see. Okay, and then if you would please take a couple of minutes to read through the rest of these. Before we start, would you please join me in a short prayer? Let us pray. Holy One, God of justice, breathe into us today a spirit of curiosity and humility. Help us engage with mindfulness, following the lead of voices from our community. Guide our speech, our self-awareness, so that we may honor the divine in all people. Amen. And now, would you please welcome Julie Decker.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me back. I had done a sort of immigration 101 presentation a while ago, I think, to this congregation, and so I'm very happy to be back to follow up on that. As mentioned, Immigrant Law Center, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3. We're based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. We do also have offices across the state and one office in Fargo, North Dakota. And we provide free legal services to low-income immigrants and refugees across the state. And I, in my role as policy director, predominantly handle our advocacy work at both the state and federal levels. So, roadmap for this presentation today, as mentioned, we will talk about some of the major legal and policy trends that we're seeing under the new administration in the immigration world. Of course, it's impossible to talk about everything that's happening. There is just too much happening. In fact, even between the time that I sent this presentation over to be uploaded for today, between like yesterday and today, between Friday and today, there have been new developments, and so it's just almost hour by hour sometimes, but we will look at sort of what has been happening generally. We'll talk about what that looks like on the ground, talk about ways to get involved, and then hopefully have time for questions and answers. I will sort of assume some sort of baseline understanding of immigration law generally, not super in depth or anything like that. But of course, if there are questions about sort of the process, the, sort of procedures, different types of statuses, also happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. So like to start, I've been doing this more and more often with presentations recently. This is a quote from a client that I worked with a number of years ago. We were at waiting for an immigration interview, and we were sitting in the waiting room looking at the immigration officers who were working at the security desk, and big beefy white guys in their glasses and their big uniforms and their firearms. And the client said to me, ellos son tan grandes y nosotros tan pequeños, which means they're so big and we're so small. And of course, this was more of a physical observation, right? But it really, in some ways, was also a very profound observation of just the system as a whole. It was these very big pieces of a system that are just sort of made to sort of chew up and spit out people who are often very vulnerable and very marginalized. So I actually had to step back when I was preparing this presentation to think about, because I've been so sort of in the weeds of just the day-to-day things that are happening, and try and step back and look at the categories of things that have been happening under the new administration since really almost right after the election, but certainly since the inauguration of the Trump administration. And what I sort of came up with is what we have seen are three sort of buckets of things that are sort of trends that are happening. The first is a sort of restriction or constriction of existing legal statuses, existing sort of eligibility requirements. So making it harder and harder, making, the existing statuses, the existing processes smaller and smaller. At the same time, we have seen, of course, and this has been maybe the most widely publicized, is the expansion of detention, deportation mechanisms and processes and procedures. And sort of around all of that is just a wholesale either bypassing and or dismantling of the systems and processes that do exist, even, to the extent that some of those systems and processes may be problematic, dismantling the ones that do exist to protect people's rights, people's due process rights in things like deportation proceedings. And so digging into those a little bit more, and again, this is not all inclusive. This is not able to cover every single thing that has happened. But sort of generally speaking, when we talk about things like restricting legal statuses, and legal status, to be clear, I'm not using that in the strictest lawyerly sense, the legalese sense, but things like, you may have heard, temporary protected status or humanitarian parole. These are types of permission where somebody who maybe is coming from Ukraine or Afghanistan or Haiti is allowed to come to the United States essentially with permission, and often are allowed to have work authorization for some sort of set amount of time, may or may not be able to stay forever, but they are sort of allowed to be here, allowed to work, and are not imminently under threat of being deported. A lot of those programs are being terminated. They're being removed. They're either being ended. They're saying we're not going to renew those programs, or we're going to end those right now, and you have to leave right now. We're not giving you 6 months. We're not giving you 3 months. Next week, you got to get out. And of course, that's a huge uprooting of people's lives. Some of these programs, of course, are relatively new, right? People who maybe came from Afghanistan or Ukraine, these might be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. On the other hand, temporary protected status for Haiti has been in place since 2010. So the temporary part of that is maybe not quite as temporary as the name maybe implies. So lots of those programs are being ended or attempted to being ended. Of course, there is litigation around those, but I will talk about how the fact that litigation, while it is an avenue for addressing some of these terminations or attempted terminations, creates a lot of additional confusion and uncertainty. At the same time, there's also been moves to narrow sort of eligibility or restrict sort of access to things like asylum, parole, other statuses generally, or other applications generally. So very early on, and I actually, to be frank, had sort of fallen out of my mind a little bit, but very early on during the Trump administration, they had essentially shut down asylum at the border. And so, asylum is people who are fleeing persecution, people who are fleeing fleeing risk of harm or death in their home countries, are asking for protection in the United States. They're allowed to do that under both international and United States law. They're allowed to come to the border and say, hey, I am afraid for my life. Allow me to apply for asylum. The United States basically went against our own laws, our own statutes, and basically shut that entire process down at the border very early on in the Trump administration and said, if you come to the southern border, you're basically sort of ineligible to even put in an application for asylum. There's litigation going on around that, but that sort of wholesale eliminated an entire sort of category of access to even just applying for a type of status. It wasn't saying, oh, we're gonna, allow you to apply, but we might deny most of you. It was, we're not even gonna let you apply. You can't even file an application. We're just not even gonna let you put an application in. You've also seen, and this gets into legalese type stuff, but you've seen a lot of stuff about student visa revocations, right? Some of this has been, you violated the conditions of your visa, but some of it has been, you weren't eligible for your visa in the first place. So we're gonna go back and say, okay, we're actually gonna try and boot you out because we don't think you should have gotten your visa in the first place. Again, sort of saying you weren't eligible at all, and so now we're gonna kick you out. There are currently budget discussions going on in Congress around a number of things, right? But one of the things that is included in the current budget proposal, one of the budget proposals, is both increases in application fees for a number of immigration applications, as well as for the first time, a application fee for asylum applications, again, for humanitarian relief, $1,000 to apply for asylum, which is wild. I cannot, even for people who have means, right? $1,000 for just to file an application is a lot of money. And then you have to, also have a provision that you would then have to you have to pay $100 every year that your application is pending. This is at the same time that they are cutting staffing for the agency that adjudicates those applications. So at the same time as they are saying, we are gonna take away all the people that actually would make the decisions on those applications, we are going to also charge you more money. We're gonna charge you money at the longer that those applications are waiting to be adjudicated. And also, we're not gonna let you have any fee waivers. So there are currently some processes that allow people who are experiencing financial hardship, such as ILCM's clients, to apply for fee waivers. They're not guaranteed, but if you can show certain factors, that you meet certain factors, you might be able to get some or all of the fees for certain applications currently to be waived. They're making that harder. They're taking it away for certain applications. They're making it harder for others. Again, restricting access to applications generally, and certainly making it essentially impossible for lower income folks to even access the lawful immigration system at all. There's also been, and this started under the first Trump administration, but is becoming much more widespread now, is just in the last couple months, now that the new administration has sort of expanded its desire, I think, and its willingness to use these to arrest and detain and deport more people. These are very, very widespread in other states, which is probably not a surprise, but yes, they have expanded greatly just nationwide since the inauguration of the Trump administration 2.0, Trump administration 2.0. We've also seen a sort of divergent paths of states generally in terms of state legislation and enforcement actions. Some states have just gone all in terms of supporting the federal government's sort of deportation agenda. We've seen Texas, Florida, even some jurisdictions that we would maybe consider more progressive or less supportive of the federal government, like in Massachusetts, for instance, over the past week or so, um, where local law enforcement are helping sort of sweep through neighborhoods and pick people up, or helping conduct massive traffic stops and arrest people for immigration enforcement purposes. Um, there are other states, however, Colorado is one major one, California to some extent is another, where they've said, nope, like we're not, get your hands off of our resources. You guys can do what you want, but we are not giving you any of our local resources or our money or our time or anything. Like, do your thing, but don't expect any help from us. Of course, what has happened now is that the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, has in fact sued, I think, Colorado and several jurisdictions over those policies. So there's also litigation around that. A lot of this has also just been straight up terroristic tactics. I mean, I don't know what else to call it.
Trump administration, the Department of Justice has in fact sued, I think, Colorado and several jurisdictions
very early on
over those policies.
The rescission of what was called, and very public rescission of what was called the Sensitive Locations Memo, which was a memo under the Biden administration, and quite frankly, the many previous administrations under both parties, which said ICE is not going to go into schools or churches or hospitals to arrest people for immigration purposes. It just seems sort of like they sort of understood that just is a bad look. Like, it just doesn't look good. Early on, I think it was like maybe the first week or so, this administration came in and very publicly said, yep, we're getting rid of that. It's all good. Everything is on the table. We will go anywhere. We will get go anywhere to get anybody. Faith-based groups did sue over that. I don't know exactly where that litigation is. I think it's still in process. I don't think there has been a full merits decision on that. Could be wrong. But again, I think just the sheer publicity of that, more so than even, I don't think we've seen a major enforcement action at like a hospital yet. Doesn't mean that we won't, but just the publicity of saying, yep, we could, we might, was, I think, very intentional. April 11th, the administration put in place a registration requirement that basically requires every person who's not a citizen, regardless of whether they're documented or not, to register with the federal government or face criminal penalties. They're creating a list of they're requiring people to put themselves on a list and either expose themselves to risk of being discovered by immigration for deportation or face criminal penalties. There was a lot of talk about workplace enforcement actions at the very beginning of the administration. I think it's interesting that we have not seen as much of that. What we have seen is these neighborhood level sweeps through communities. Even before the administration took office, there was this enforcement action in Central California where ICE staked out the gas station where all the day laborers went for breakfast before they went to the fields, and just picked up everybody that stopped by the gas station for breakfast that morning. And that has been, again, I think that has been sort of the MO of a lot of these enforcement actions since the administration took office. Is not so much they aren't going into it's not to say they won't do it, but they haven't been going into the factories and shutting down a factory and just, sort of separating everybody out and then arresting the people who don't appear to have papers, don't appear to have status. It has been neighborhood level, knocking on doors, stopping people in their cars, breaking car windows, pulling people out of their homes and their cars, and dragging them away, quite frankly. There has also been the use of Guantanamo, which, again, it was appalling to me that I'd almost sort of forgotten that happened because it was so early in the administration. There were a couple flights to Guantanamo. And then, of course, the CCOT prison in El Salvador. There were also removals to some facilities. I mean, it wasn't even prisons. It was flights to an airport in Panama, on the edge of the Darien Gap, which is this sort of wilderness area between Colombia and Panama. And we just dumped a bunch of people there and left them. Again, that was very early in the administration. And the administration has really sort of said that the argument that's been made is that once they're outside the U.S. borders, even though we're paying to fly these people outside the United States to deport them, sometimes we're paying to detain them in CCOT or wherever else. Once they're outside the U.S. borders, there's nothing we can do. And we could maybe bring them back, but we're not going to. So again, I think this is just intentional, fear-based, tactics around deportations. I will say it's interesting, at least the numbers that have been sort of reported out, and it's very hard to get numbers because transparency is way down, oversight is way down. It's not clear that the sheer numbers are actually up from previous administrations or from the previous Trump administration even, whether they're actually deporting more people, removing more people. But, the stories that are coming out, of course, are that the people that they are removing are often people with very minor criminal records or no criminal records at all, and often people who have valid protection-based claims or humanitarian claims, or who had pending hearings for humanitarian protection or other types of status. In terms of the sort of bypassing and dismantling of systems, I mean, I think I sort of imply or mentioned this already, but the invocation of wartime authorities, and I think this is something that we'll have to keep an eye on because the Alien Enemies Act was one of them. There has been a lot of chatter about the idea that they could also invoke the Insurrection Act, which would, open up a lot of additional federal military resources, including the use of the National Guard to do things like immigration enforcement. The main trend I think that we have certainly seen in immigration executive orders has been a lot of language around invasion, insurrection, sovereignty. I don't know if people saw just in the last 24 hours, Stephen Miller came out and has talked about the potential to suspend habeas corpus, again used the language of invasion. Now there have been a couple federal courts that have said, this seems pretty thin, legally speaking, this idea that we're under an invasion, at least when it comes to this idea for the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, that we're somehow under an invasion and therefore you can, boot people out under the idea that they're gang members from Venezuela. However, remains to be seen whether they really care at this point, because as I've noted here, they are defying judicial orders, particularly in the case of Gilmar Abrego Garcia, who is the El Salvadorian national who was under withholding of removal status and was removed to El Salvador anyways, and they have been told to bring him back and they haven't brought him back. Repeatedly have been told to bring him back and they haven't brought him back. There are a number of other federal court orders under which they appear to not be entirely complying. The one other one that I know I'm aware of in the immigration space is that they were told to restore funding for legal representation for unaccompanied minors, and they haven't done it. So the concern, right, is that as we continue to see use of wartime authorities, this language around invasion, insurrection, these suggestions of suspending additional sort of constitutional rights, and the defiance of judicial orders, does it really matter? Does the litigation really matter? Does securing any type of court decision, even on the merits, particularly matter at this point? And that's not, unfortunately, as a lawyer, even I'm not sure that's a question that I can answer at this point. The other thing that I mentioned as earlier is just that we have seen a lot of staffing cuts, a lot of funding cuts generally across the entire sort of sector, and this includes the agencies, this includes nonprofits, potential federal funding cuts just generally to any type of state or local program, regardless of what it is, unless the state or locality cooperates with immigration enforcement. So, for instance, federal highway funding, I think, is one of the things that's been used as sort of leverage to potentially say, if you don't, let us, commandeer your resources, your local resources to do immigration enforcement in your state, then you're not getting your federal highway funds or whatever. And, what, which state, what state governor feels like they can, say no to federal highway funds. I mean, that's a tough ask for any state government, realistically. So, on the ground, I mean, there's a lot of these pieces that are not going to be a surprise and are not new to just this administration, but of course are being ramped up and are being, I think, weaponized intentionally under this new administration. And these are things like family separation and family detention, the removal of people with status, but even up to and including U.S. citizens. So there were some really just awful stories just in the last couple of weeks of U.S. citizen children who were removed, including a U.S. citizen child with cancer. U.S. citizens who are being detained by immigration authorities despite, evidence of their citizenship, and often being held for days or weeks at a time before they're able to be released. Massive constitutional violations. And this is an area where, on the one hand, you do sometimes see, eventually you will see some of these constitutional issues to some extent play out in a successful way in an impact litigation sort of context to some extent. But in the immigration context itself, a lot of times it doesn't really matter for the immigrant themselves, because in the immigration proceeding, the person is still going to end up deported, because the immigration case, they don't care. And for those of you, I don't know, there may be some lawyers in this room. Immigration court is not regular court. There are no rules of evidence or rules of civil procedure or rules of criminal procedure the way there would be in a regular court proceeding. And so Fourth Amendment rule of the fruit of the poisonous tree doesn't apply. Hearsay rules don't apply. Deportation doesn't hinge on any of those things. There have been 7 deaths in detention since the inauguration. Again, not new. This is not a new thing. ICE detention conditions have been and continue to be a major issue. But as detention continues to ramp up and oversight continues to be removed, it is likely that this is a trend that will continue to get worse. And then the fear and confusion, and this is obviously, on the one hand, just a community-based, right? People feel this on a day-to-day level. There's been reporting about how even in Minnesota, on Lake Street, people are seeing a drop in business because people are reducing their sort of day-to-day outings because of the fear of, you go to school, you take your kids to school and you get picked up, by ICE and you don't come home. But I think also what I had mentioned is, even in the litigation context, if there's a lawsuit about TPS for Venezuela, you might get a pause, like maybe we get a pause and they say, okay, you can't end temporary protected status for Venezuelans right now. Great. But we aren't going to extend their work permits either. We're just going to wait. We're not going to end it. We're going to have a full argument on the, process by which you terminated the temporary protected status. And in the meantime, we're just going to leave it in limbo. We're not going to renew work permits. We're not going to do anything in addition to, waiting to see what happens with the program. Okay, so what about those, tens of thousands of people whose work permits are expiring and all of a sudden are going to lose their jobs and can't work to feed their families, what are they supposed to do? And uh, are they supposed to work without permission? Are they supposed to, and are they supposed to ask for benefits that they are not technically eligible for? And how, I mean, it just creates this incredible, like, catch-22 for these folks. And also, like, what do you, I mean, I understand why, we get calls, for instance, from people who are like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to resolve my situation? There's no legal answer there, because it's like, well, I can tell you that your TPS technically isn't gone. Like, under the law, under this injunction, this pause that the court just put in place, it's not gone. But your work card also can't be renewed. That's sorry. Like, it's not a solution. I mean, it's we may eventually get there, but in the meantime, tens of thousands of you are probably going to suffer really badly. So in Minnesota, this is just a sampling of some of the things that have been reported on in Minnesota. We've seen student visa chaos. We've seen Minneapolis and St. Paul are both sanctuary cities, and they've been involved in litigation. I think it's been interesting to see that in addition to the 287G agreements, there's actually quite a bit of entanglement with ICE beyond just the 287 sort of enforcement agreements. There's a bunch of ICE contracts with gun ranges across the metro area for training. And in fact, we are one of the we have some of the biggest contracts in the nation, besides, I think, Texas. So it's an interesting insight into, all the different ways that even states like Minnesota can be very, very sort of enmeshed in a lot of these agencies and industries, quite frankly. I will say the Minnesota Attorney General's office has a lot of good guidance. They've been putting out sort of just really solid, reasonable, legally based guidance on various interactions, organizations, sensitive locations, schools, like how, what are the obligations and responsibilities of different institutions on how to interact with immigration enforcement. And I think that can be really helpful for a lot of different institutions. And I think that we are in many ways very fortunate to have media who are willing to dig into different aspects of immigration involvement and enforcement in Minnesota beyond just sort of the top line stuff that's happening. I mean, the top line stuff is very important, but as I'm sort of noting here, there are a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that are also, I think, very important. So in terms of a few things, staying informed, getting involved, it's really hard staying informed. I get that. And I also get that this is one piece of a moment in time where lots of things are spiraling. I've listed just 3 resources that I rely on a lot to keep me informed on a very grounded basis, not on a sort of like hair on fire basis. And I particularly like the litigation tracker because it keeps me, they give a very good summary, even for non-lawyers, of the different lawsuits that are happening. And you can filter them out by subject area. So you can look at just like immigration, you can look at like EPA, you can look at any number of different subject areas, and they just give sort of updates of like, oh, okay, there was an injunction, there was this, there was that. It's super helpful. The Minnesota Department of Human Services has what's called an immigration hub, which is a consortium of our office plus other legal service organizations here in the state. And we do a bunch of different trainings around just immigration generally, like 101 / sort of sort of services and stuff like that. And they're aimed at different groups. So some of them are for teachers, some of them are for social workers, but we also have community advocates trainings, and they sort of cycle through. And so those are posted periodically on the DHS, state DHS, not federal DHS website. And then a couple volunteer opportunities that, and I know a couple people already do this, the Advocates for Human Rights has an immigration court monitoring program that is, I think, really valuable in that it gives a really important insight into what happens in immigration court and just how easy it is to end up in the system and how incredibly complex and hard it is to deal with it once you're in it. I also think it's, quite frankly, very telling how dehumanizing it is, particularly if you observe any of the detained court hearings and the way that detainees, despite the fact that they're civil detainees, are treated in those proceedings because they are brought in orange prison jumpsuits as if they're criminal detainees, even though they're civil detainees. They are handcuffed and they're shackled, hand and foot. And then there's also a group called Conversations with Friends, which has been around for a number of years, as long as I've been practicing, probably longer. They do letter writing and also in-person visits with people in ICE detention. And they also do, so if people are released from ICE detention, this group will provide them with some very basic resources, like a phone card or a bus card, like a backpack with some basic resources. I will say when people are released from ICE detention, it is like often, it should be a really like happy experience, and sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's incredibly traumatizing because they will just like dump these people out. Like they'll just like release them at any time of the day, any season. They won't tell them what's happening. They just sort of let them go from the jail, and that's it. They often have next to nothing because, of course, they were arrested just on the street somewhere. And so, of course, they don't have anything with them when they are then released. And they have also sometimes been in detention for months or years. So those are two very good organizations that I would highly suggest getting involved in if you are willing and able. Contact information for Immigrant Law Center, both in terms of people who need legal resources as well as just staying informed about the work that we're doing. And we do periodic sort of just updates on current events, social media. And with that, I went a little over time, I apologize. But there's Q&A, and then I think also a moment for, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, your work. My name is Wayne Shockey. I'm a retired lawyer who had the privilege of being a pro bono asylum lawyer. Best thing I ever did. Oh, and one of the things that's occurred to me recently in all of this discussion, there's a non-recognition of the fact that Minnesota, the United States generally, has a declining and aging population, and we need more people, i.e. more immigrants. And that should be the focus of the conversation and the effort in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. In the meantime, we have to combat the horrendous bad policies and actions of the Trump administration and do everything we can to help the immigrants who are currently caught within the system.
Yeah, I agree.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I mean, if we're all devastated by what you have to say, I don't know how you do your work every day and still stay positive. So thank you. I was just reminded of the recent effort to get Afrikaner refugees here. They're taking away all the refugees from everywhere else, and we're bringing in people that feel like they're under attack in South Africa. And I mean, I don't recognize our country anymore, but could you talk a little bit about how that fits into any immigration policy we have right now? And I guess I'm at a loss for words to even ask the question, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think at base, it sort of goes back just to the fact that, you know, a lot of our immigration and laws and policies were rooted in very race-based policies. You know, a lot of the early laws were actually based around racial exclusion. You know, Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, Japanese exclusion. You know, I mean, a lot of the historical laws, you know, it was, you know, racist policy, quite frankly. And so I think to sort of ignore that as, you know, in favor of assuming that, you know, our entire sort of immigration law and policy has always been in favor of, you know, like a melting pot is you know, naive, right? And not historically accurate. I mean, I don't know that there's any, as you noted, I'm not sure that there's any words that can describe it as any type of reasonable immigration policy. I'm not sure that anything that has been done since the inauguration could be described as reasonable immigration policy. It has been a flooding of the zone of, you know, cruelty and, you know, terroristic sort of attacks on not just immigrants, but people who look like immigrants, people who look like other. So, yeah.
Julia, thank you for coming. One of the things that I think a lot of people lose sight of the fact is that the immigration courts are actually part of the administration. They're not part of the judicial branch. Judges are appointed by the executive branch, and they can set quotas if they want to on the number of decisions going one way or the other. But my question is there an advantage to someone having representation, legal representation, in an immigration court hearing, or is it just a waste of everybody's time?
Yeah, so there's a numbers answer, and then there's a philosophical answer. So numbers wise, there's statistics that show that if people with representation in immigration court statistically have better outcomes in terms of winning relief against removal. You know, the philosophical answer is, are you helping support a system that maintains harmful structures that, you know, privilege some at the cost of others, and upholds you know, yeah, a system that is based in executive sort of supremacy over people's lives at the expense of humanity. And I wish I had an answer to that. I don't. And I ask that, that's a very fair question. And I will just say that as an immigration lawyer, I ask myself that question. I hope that every immigration lawyer asks themselves that question repeatedly, because if they don't, I don't think that they are doing enough self-reflection about their job in the system.
No. Thank you, Julia, for your insights and perspective. Next week, we will continue our series on current immigration concerns as we welcome Michelle Garrett McKenzie from Advocates for Human Rights. We look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you for being here.